I had to take my daughter to the hospital and couldn't stop laughing. The call came during my lunch break at the construction site, right as I was biting into a sandwich that tasted like sawdust and regret. My phone vibrated against the metal lunch pail, and I saw the school's number flash across the screen with that particular dread every parent knows. I answered on the second ring, already calculating how fast I could get there if this was serious. The voice on the other end belonged to Mrs. Kepler, the school secretary, and she had that careful, measured tone people use when they're trying very hard not to alarm you, which of course does the exact opposite. She said my daughter Zoe had been involved in an incident, and I needed to come immediately. Not hurt, she clarified quickly when I started asking questions, but there had been a situation that required my immediate attention and possibly legal consultation. Legal consultation. Those two words made my stomach drop through the floor of the trailer where we took breaks. I told my foreman I had a family emergency and drove the 12 minutes to Zoe's elementary school in about 7, my hands gripping the steering wheel hard enough to leave marks. My daughter was 9 years old, quiet, the kind of kid who brought home injured birds and cried during sad commercials. What kind of incident could possibly require legal anything? I parked in the visitor lot and jogged toward the main entrance, my work boots leaving dirt tracks across the polished floor that some janitor would hate me for later. Mrs. Kepler was waiting just inside, her expression professionally neutral in a way that told me absolutely nothing except that whatever had happened was bad enough that she'd practiced her face in a mirror. She led me down the hallway toward the principal's office, past walls covered in children's artwork and motivational posters about kindness and inclusion that suddenly felt deeply ironic. Principal Davison was waiting in his office along with another man I didn't recognize, someone in an expensive suit who looked out of place among the child-sized furniture and crayon drawings. Zoe sat in a chair by the window, her legs swinging because they didn't quite reach the floor, her school uniform rumpled and her dark hair escaping from the ponytail I'd carefully done that morning. What struck me immediately was the blood, not a lot, but enough, dried and dark on her collar, a smear across her left cheek that someone had tried to wipe away but hadn't quite managed. She looked up when I entered, and instead of the tears or fear I expected, her blue eyes held something I'd never seen in them before. Defiance, maybe, or satisfaction. Principal Davison stood and extended his hand, which I shook automatically while trying to process the scene in front of me. The man in the suit introduced himself as Lawrence Blackwell, attorney representing the Thornhill family, and that's when the pieces started clicking together. With sickening clarity, the Thornhills. Of course, their son Marcus was in Zoe's class, and I'd heard his name before, always in contexts that made my jaw tight. Marcus Thornhill, who'd been caught stealing other kids' lunches. Marcus Thornhill, who'd pushed a first grader off the playground equipment hard enough to require stitches. Marcus Thornhill, whose parents were both attorneys at some prestigious firm downtown and who'd somehow convinced the school that their son's behavioral issues were everyone else's fault. I'd seen Marcus once during pickup, a heavy-set kid with mean eyes who'd been shoving smaller children out of his way while his mother scrolled through her phone, completely oblivious. Davison cleared his throat and gestured for me to sit in one of the adult-sized chairs across from his desk. He explained in that careful administrator voice that there had been a serious altercation during lunch period, that Marcus Thornhill had sustained injuries requiring medical attention, and that his parents were threatening legal action against the school, and specifically against Zoe. I looked at my daughter, at the blood on her clothes, and felt my protective instincts roar to life. I asked if Zoe was hurt, why she had blood on her, why I was being told about another kid's injuries before anyone checked if my daughter needed a hospital. Davison exchanged a glance with Blackwell before explaining that the blood on Zoe was Marcus's, that she had been the aggressor in the situation, and that the school had very serious concerns about her behavior and continued enrollment. The word aggressor applied to my daughter made me want to laugh, except nothing about this situation was funny. Zoe, who'd begged me to rescue a spider from our bathtub last week instead of killing it. Zoe, who'd saved her allowance for 3 months to donate to an animal shelter. This kid had apparently hurt someone badly enough to make lawyers show up. I asked Zoe directly to tell me what happened, and Davison started to interrupt with something about how she'd already given her statement, but I cut him off. I wanted to hear it from her, in her own words, without adults filtering or interpreting or protecting their liability. Blackwell objected, saying anything Zoe said could be used in litigation, but I told him to shut up. My daughter wasn't on trial, and I wasn't going to be intimidated in a room full of motivational posters about sharing and caring. Zoe looked at me with those serious eyes she'd inherited from her mother, the same expression my late wife Julia had worn when she'd had to tell me difficult truths. She said Marcus had been hurting Lily Chen for weeks, that everyone knew it, but nobody did anything because Marcus's parents always made it go away. Lily was a tiny girl from Taiwan who'd just moved to the district and barely spoke English, which apparently made her a target. Marcus would steal her food, knock her books off her desk, trip her in the hallway, call her names that made her cry. The teachers had been informed multiple times, Zoe said, but nothing ever happened except Marcus missing recess for a day before going right back to his behavior. Today at lunch, Marcus had cornered Lily by the trash cans and was forcing her face down toward a puddle of spilled milk mixed with dirt, trying to make her eat it while other kids laughed or looked away because nobody wanted to be his next target. The room went very quiet as Zoe continued talking. She said she'd walked over and told Marcus to stop, that Lily hadn't done anything to him and he should leave her alone. Marcus had shoved Zoe hard enough that she'd fallen, then turned back to Lily and grabbed her hair to push her face closer to the puddle. That's when Zoe had gotten up, picked up her lunch tray, one of those heavy plastic ones with divided sections, and hit Marcus across the back of his head hard enough that he'd fallen forward and split his lip on the edge of the trash can. She'd stood over him while he was on the ground, she admitted in that same matter-of-fact tone, and told him if he ever touched Lily or anyone else again, she'd do worse. Then she'd helped Lily wash her face and walked her to the nurse's office before a teacher even arrived to break things up. Principal Davison's expression had gone carefully blank during this recitation, the kind of blank that meant he knew exactly what she was talking about and was trying very hard not to confirm it. Blackwell started talking about assault, about excessive force, about how a 9-year-old girl attacking his client's son was criminal behavior that couldn't be excused, regardless of the circumstances. I felt something cold and sharp settle in my chest as I listened to this man in his $1,000 suit defend a bully who'd been terrorizing smaller kids while the school looked the other way. I asked Davison directly how many times Marcus had been reported for hurting other students, how many complaints from parents he'd ignored, how many incidents had been swept under the rug because the Thornhills threatened litigation every time someone suggested their son had behavioral problems. Davison started to give me some administrative double talk about privacy and confidentiality, but I cut through it. I said I wanted to see the incident reports, wanted copies of every complaint filed about Marcus Thornhill, wanted documentation of what the school had done to protect students from a kid who was clearly dangerous. Blackwell objected again, claiming that information was protected, but I pointed out that my daughter was being threatened with expulsion and possible criminal charges, which meant I had every right to understand the full context. I pulled out my phone and started recording, stating clearly that I was documenting this meeting for legal purposes, and watched both Davison and Blackwell's faces change as they realized this wasn't going to be the intimidation session they'd planned. I asked Zoe if she wanted to add anything, if there were details she thought I should know, and she said quietly that Marcus had broken Lily's glasses 2 weeks ago, and Lily's family couldn't afford to replace them, so she'd been squinting at the board ever since. That detail hit me harder than it should have, maybe because it was so specific, so real, so completely indicative of systematic failure. A child couldn't see in class because some bully had destroyed her glasses, and nobody in authority had done anything about it. I asked Davison what the school's policy was on bullying, on physical assault between students, on protecting vulnerable kids from repeated abuse. He started reading from what was clearly a rehearsed statement about their zero-tolerance policy and commitment to student safety, all of it meaningless corporate language that dissolved into nothing when tested against reality. I asked why that zero-tolerance policy hadn't applied to Marcus Thornhill, why a kid who'd been reported multiple times for violence was still in regular classes without supervision or consequences. Blackwell tried to redirect, saying we were here to discuss Zoe's behavior, not his client's son's educational history, but I wasn't done. I asked if the school had documented today's incident, if they had witness statements from other students, if anyone had bothered to check on Lily Chen or ask how she was doing. Davison admitted they had several student witnesses who'd corroborated Zoe's version of events, that Lily had been taken to the counselor's office and her parents had been called. So you have multiple witnesses confirming that Marcus was assaulting another student when Zoe intervened, I said slowly, making sure my phone was still recording. You have documentation of a pattern of behavior from Marcus. You have a victim who's been repeatedly targeted with no intervention from staff, and your response is to threaten my daughter with expulsion and let his parents bring their lawyer to intimidate a 9-year-old. Blackwell started to argue that defending yourself was different from attacking someone, but I pointed out that Zoe wasn't defending herself. She was defending someone else who couldn't defend themselves, which in my understanding was called being a good Samaritan. The atmosphere in the room shifted as I kept pressing. I asked what would have happened if Zoe hadn't intervened. If Marcus had successfully forced Lily to eat garbage off the ground, would that have finally been enough for consequences? Or would it have been dismissed as boys being boys, kids being kids, no permanent harm done? Davison was sweating now, his carefully maintained administrator mask slipping to show the bureaucrat underneath, who knew his school had failed multiple children but was more worried about liability than making it right. I told him I wanted copies of all incident reports involving Marcus Thornhill, that I'd be filing a formal complaint with the district about the school's failure to protect students, and that if he even suggested suspending or punishing Zoe for defending another child from assault, I'd be contacting every parent in that classroom to let them know their kids weren't safe here. Blackwell stood up, trying to reassert control of a conversation that had gotten away from him. He said the Thornhills weren't going to let this go, that Zoe had caused Marcus significant physical and emotional trauma, that there would be consequences regardless of the circumstances. I stood too, which made me at least 6 inches taller than him, and asked if he was threatening a 9-year-old girl with legal action for stopping his client's son from assaulting another child. He backpedaled, saying of course not, but they expected the school to take appropriate disciplinary measures and for our family to cover Marcus's medical expenses. I laughed, actually laughed, which clearly wasn't the reaction he expected. I told him Marcus's medical expenses could be covered by his parents' insurance, same as anyone else's, and if they wanted to pursue civil litigation, they should know that I'd be countersuing for emotional distress, harassment, and intimidation. I wasn't actually sure if those were real causes of action, but Blackwell didn't need to know that. Davison tried to mediate, suggesting we all take a step back and approach this calmly, but I was done being calm. I'd been calm when Zoe first came home with stories about Marcus being mean to other kids. I'd been calm when I'd sent a polite email asking about the situation. I'd been calm when I'd been told the school was handling it. Being calm had gotten us to a place where my daughter felt she had no choice but to physically defend another child because every adult in authority had failed to do so. I asked Zoe if she was hurt anywhere, if Marcus had injured her when he'd shoved her down, and she said her elbow was bruised but it didn't hurt much. I told Davison we were leaving, that Zoe wouldn't be back to school until I had written assurance that Marcus Thornhill would be supervised at all times and that the school had implemented actual consequences for his behavior, not just empty promises. Blackwell blocked the door, which was either very brave or very stupid. He said we couldn't leave in the middle of a disciplinary proceeding, that there were procedures that had to be followed. I told him to move or I'd add unlawful restraint to the complaints I was planning to file. He didn't move. I pulled out my phone, still recording, and asked clearly if he was preventing me from leaving this office with my minor child, if he was physically blocking our exit. His face went red, but he stepped aside. I took Zoe's hand, her small fingers squeezed mine tight, and walked out of that office with as much dignity as I could manage while wearing dusty work boots and a flannel shirt with torn elbows. Behind us, I could hear Davison and Blackwell having a heated conversation in lowered voices, but I didn't care. My daughter had done the right thing in a situation where every adult had done the wrong thing, and I'd be damned if she was going to be punished for it. We walked through the school hallways in silence, past those same motivational posters that now felt like mockery. Outside, the afternoon sun was warm, and I realized I'd completely forgotten about work, about my sandwich sitting half-eaten in my lunch pail, about the deadline we were trying to meet on the current project. None of it mattered compared to this. I unlocked my truck and helped Zoe climb into the passenger seat, checking her elbow like she'd said. There was a decent bruise forming, purple and ugly against her pale skin. I asked if she wanted ice cream, which was a stupid dad thing to suggest, but I didn't know what else to offer. She said no, she wanted to go home, so I drove us back to our small house on the edge of town, the one that still had Julia's garden in the backyard, slowly being reclaimed by weeds because I didn't have her talent for making things grow. Inside, I made Zoe change out of her bloody clothes and get cleaned up while I sat at our kitchen table trying to figure out what to do next. I wasn't actually a lawyer, despite how I'd talked in that office. I was a construction project manager who'd watched enough legal dramas to fake competence, but had no idea how to actually file complaints with school districts or countersue wealthy attorneys. But I knew people who knew people, and I started making calls. First to Tommy Reeves, my foreman, apologizing for disappearing and explaining the situation in broad strokes. He told me to take the rest of the week if I needed it. That family came first. Then to my late wife's best friend, Sarah, who was a paralegal and might know how to navigate the system. She listened to the whole story, asked me to send her the recording, and said she'd make some calls to attorneys who specialized in education law and civil rights. Zoe came into the kitchen wearing clean clothes, her hair damp from washing it. She looked smaller somehow, younger, and I realized she'd been carrying this burden of watching another kid get bullied for weeks without knowing how to fix it. I asked her why she hadn't told me sooner, why she'd let it get to the point where she felt she had to physically intervene. She climbed into my lap even though she was getting too big for it, tucking her head under my chin the way she used to when she was tiny. She said she'd told her teacher, Mrs. Alvarez, multiple times. Mrs. Alvarez had said she'd handle it. but nothing changed. Marcus just got meaner, and Lily got quieter, and eventually Zoe realized that adults saying they'd handle something didn't mean they actually would. That broke something in me, hearing my daughter explain in her 9-year-old voice that she'd lost faith in the adults around her to protect children who needed protecting. I held her and told her she'd done the right thing, that defending someone who couldn't defend themselves was always the right thing, even when it was scary or difficult. I also told her that violence should be a last resort, that there were better ways to solve problems, but I didn't really believe that even as I said it. The better ways had failed. The proper channels had failed. The zero-tolerance policy had failed. Sometimes I was learning the right thing looks an awful lot like the wrong thing until you understand the context. My phone started ringing, Sarah calling back with names of 3 attorneys who specialized in cases like ours, who worked on contingency or sliding scale, who would be interested in a case involving systemic failure to protect students. I wrote down names and numbers, feeling the first stirrings of something that might have been hope or might have been rage. Hard to tell the difference sometimes. That evening, I got a call from an unknown number that turned out to be Lily Chen's mother, Mrs. Chen, speaking in heavily accented English. She was crying, thanking me, saying that Lily had told her what Zoe did, that she'd been so scared for her daughter but didn't know how to complain because her English wasn't good and she didn't understand American schools. She said Lily asked if Zoe could come visit because she wanted to say thank you, and would I mind if she brought over dinner as a small gesture of appreciation. I said of course, we'd be honored, even though I felt guilty accepting thanks for my daughter hitting another child with a lunch tray. But Mrs. Chen seemed to understand the complexity better than I did, seemed to recognize that sometimes protection looks violent even when it's necessary, that keeping someone safe isn't always gentle. Mrs. Chen arrived an hour later with enough food to feed 6 people, steaming containers of dumplings, noodles, vegetables cooked in sauces I couldn't identify but tasted incredible. Lily came with her, a tiny girl with delicate features and enormous dark eyes that darted around nervously until she saw Zoe. Then her whole face lit up, and she rushed over, hugging Zoe with an intensity that made my chest tight. She whispered something in Mandarin, and Mrs. Chen translated, "Thank you for being brave for me." The 2 girls sat together on our couch, speaking in some combination of English and gestures and the universal language of children who'd shared trauma. Mrs. Chen sat with me at the kitchen table, and through broken English and hand gestures and occasional translation from Lily, she told me her story. They'd moved here 3 months ago for her husband's job at the tech company across town. Lily had been so excited about American school, about making friends, about learning English faster. But Marcus had targeted her from the first week, probably sensing she was vulnerable because of the language barrier. Mrs. Chen had gone to the school twice to complain, but her English made communication difficult, and she wasn't sure if they understood the severity. The school had told her they'd address it, but Lily kept coming home with torn papers, bruised arms, and increasingly desperate pleas to not have to go back. Mrs. Chen had been researching other schools, considering quitting her own job to homeschool, trying to figure out how to protect her daughter without destroying the opportunities that had brought them to America in the first place. Then today, Lily had come home and told her mother that an angel had saved her, that Zoe had made the bad boy stop and promised he wouldn't hurt anyone again. I didn't feel like the parent of an angel. I felt like the parent of a child who'd been forced into an impossible situation by adults who should have handled it. But looking at Lily's face as she laughed at something Zoe showed her on our old tablet, I understood that sometimes perception matters more than reality. To Lily, Zoe was a hero. To Mrs. Chen, my daughter's intervention had saved her child from ongoing trauma. To the school and the Thornhills, Zoe was a violent problem that needed to be controlled. Truth, I was learning, was less absolute than I'd always believed. Mrs. Chen asked what would happen now, if Zoe would be in trouble, and I honestly didn't know. I told her about the attorneys Sarah had referred us to, about the recording I'd made, about my plan to force the school district to address Marcus's behavior pattern. She nodded seriously and said she wanted to help, that she would file her own complaints, that other parents needed to know what was happening. Over the next few days, things escalated in ways I hadn't anticipated. Sarah connected me with an attorney named David Ortega who specialized in education law and was genuinely angry about what had happened. He took our case pro bono after listening to my recording and reviewing the timeline, saying this was exactly the kind of systemic failure that created dangerous situations for vulnerable students. He filed formal complaints with the school district, requested all documentation related to Marcus Thornhill's disciplinary history under Freedom of Information laws, and sent letters to the Thornhills' attorney making it clear that any legal action against Zoe would be met with counterclaims and extensive discovery. Mrs. Chen filed her own complaints through Ortega's office. And suddenly the narrative shifted from one problem child defending another to a pattern of school administrators ignoring reports about a dangerous student because his parents had money and influence. The story hit local news 3 days later, though without names since minors were involved. Elementary school faces questions about bullying response. After student intervention leads to injury, read the headline, and the accompanying article detailed the situation in carefully neutral language that nonetheless made the school look terrible. How the district's own policies required intervention in bullying situations, how multiple reports had been filed and ignored, how a student had finally felt compelled to physically defend another student after administrative channels failed. The reporter had somehow gotten hold of statistics showing Marcus's school had a significantly higher rate of bullying complaints than other elementary schools in the district, suggesting systemic problems beyond one incident. My phone started ringing with other parents calling to share their own stories about Marcus or other problem students whose behavior was excused because of parental influence. Davison called me directly, which surprised me. His voice had lost that careful administrator neutrality and just sounded tired. He said the school board had placed him on administrative leave pending investigation into his handling of the situation, that the Thornhills were threatening to sue the district for failing to protect Marcus from assault, and that everything was spiraling beyond anyone's control. He wanted me to know, off the record, he emphasized, that he'd been trying to address Marcus's behavior for over a year, but had been consistently overruled by the superintendent, who was personal friends with Marcus's father. Every time he'd tried to implement consequences, he'd been told to back off, to give the family more time, to remember that the Thornhills donated significantly to school programs and could make trouble. Davison said he was sorry, that he should have fought harder regardless of the politics, that he'd failed Lily and Zoe and every other kid who'd been hurt because he prioritized keeping his job over doing it correctly. I didn't know what to do with that apology. Part of me wanted to tell him it was too late, that his failure had put my daughter in an impossible position. But another part understood that systemic problems were bigger than individual people, that Davison was another victim of the same corruption that had protected Marcus for so long. I told him I appreciated him calling, that I hoped he'd be willing to provide testimony if this went further, and that maybe his administrative leave was an opportunity to decide whether he wanted to keep being part of a system that protected the wrong people. He was quiet for a long moment before thanking me and hanging up. Later that day, I heard through Sarah's paralegal connections that Davison had resigned rather than face investigation, and that the superintendent had also been placed on leave as the school board tried to contain the growing scandal. The Thornhills' attorney sent a formal demand letter requiring $50,000 for Marcus's medical expenses, pain and suffering, and emotional trauma. Ortega responded with our own demand letter outlining Zoe's emotional distress from watching another child be assaulted, her physical injuries from being shoved, and the school's failure to provide a safe learning environment. He attached witness statements from 8 different students who'd seen Marcus hurt other children, documented, complaints from 5 families dating back 18 months, and a psychological evaluation of Lily showing symptoms of PTSD from prolonged bullying. The letter concluded by stating that if the Thornhills insisted on pursuing legal action, we'd be filing a cross-complaint and publicizing Marcus's full behavioral history, which would likely impact his ability to enroll in other private schools if they decided to leave the district. It was legal hardball, and I felt slightly sick participating in it. But Ortega assured me this was how you dealt with wealthy people trying to intimidate working-class families into submission. 2 weeks after the incident, I got another call from the school district, this time from a woman who identified herself as Monica Fletcher, the newly appointed interim principal at Zoe's school. She asked if we could meet to discuss Zoe's return to classes and some policy changes the district was implementing. I was immediately suspicious, assuming this was another intimidation session, but she insisted this was different, that she wanted to make things right. I agreed to meet at a neutral location, a coffee shop near the school, and brought Ortega with me just in case. Fletcher turned out to be a woman in her 50s with gray hair and a no-nonsense demeanor that reminded me of my grandmother. She didn't waste time with small talk, just pulled out a folder full of documents and started explaining. The school board had conducted an emergency review of bullying policies across all district schools, she said. They'd discovered that Zoe's school had the highest rate of reported incidents and the lowest rate of documented resolutions, which suggested exactly what we'd been claiming: systematic failure to address problems. Marcus Thornhill had been removed from regular classes, pending a behavioral evaluation, and was currently in an alternative education program with one-on-one supervision. The superintendent had been fired, not just placed on leave, and the district was implementing new, mandatory reporting procedures requiring principals to document every bullying complaint and their response within 48 hours, with oversight from the school board. Fletcher acknowledged this should have been policy all along, that it shouldn't have taken a child getting hurt for administrators to do their jobs, but she wanted us to know changes were happening. She also said, and this is what made me start laughing in that coffee shop, inappropriate laughter that made other patrons look over concerned, that the Thornhills had withdrawn Marcus from the school entirely and enrolled him in a private academy across town. But the private academy had called the district requesting records, and when they'd seen Marcus's behavioral history, they'd rescinded the admission offer. The Thornhills were now threatening to sue that school too, but word was spreading through private school networks, and Marcus was getting rejected from institutions his parents considered worthy. Fletcher said the family was probably going to end up homeschooling or leaving the area entirely, which seemed like appropriate consequences for enabling their son's violence for years. Ortega kicked me under the table to stop my inappropriate laughter, but I couldn't help it. The whole situation was so absurd. Wealthy parents discovering that money couldn't buy their way out of their child's reputation, that the consequences they'd spent years avoiding had finally caught up with them. Fletcher continued, explaining that the district wanted to settle any potential litigation by offering Zoe a formal apology, guaranteeing her a spot at any district school she chose, including specialized programs, and providing counseling services if needed. They were also offering a college scholarship fund in Zoe's name, not as payment, but as recognition that she'd exposed systematic failures that needed correction. I looked at Ortega, who was reading through the settlement documents carefully, occasionally making notes. He pointed out that the proposed scholarship fund was $5,000, which was insulting given the scope of what had happened. Fletcher agreed and said she'd push for $25,000, which seemed more appropriate for a 4-year scholarship program. They went back and forth negotiating details while I sat there trying to process that my daughter hitting a bully with a lunch tray had somehow resulted in district-wide policy changes and scholarship funds. I asked Fletcher about Lily Chen, whether the district was doing anything to address her trauma or help her family. Fletcher nodded and said Mrs. Chen had met with her several times, that they were providing Lily with English tutoring and counseling services, that they'd arranged for a translator to be available for parent-teacher conferences going forward. The district was also implementing cultural sensitivity training for all staff, after recognizing that language barriers had prevented proper response to the Chen's complaints. Again, Fletcher emphasized this should have been standard practice, that it shouldn't take a crisis to force institutional change, but at least they were moving in the right direction. She asked if I'd be willing to serve on a parent advisory board that would provide oversight of the new bullying response protocols, ensuring they were actually implemented rather than just documented for liability purposes. I said I'd think about it, which really meant yes, but I needed time to process everything. Ortega negotiated the final settlement terms over the next week. The district agreed to $30,000 for the scholarship fund, formal written apologies to both Zoe and Lily's families, mandatory reporting procedures with quarterly reviews, and a commitment to cultural sensitivity training for all staff. The Thornhills dropped their demand letter after Ortega made it clear that discovery would expose Marcus's behavioral history in detail and likely result in counterclaims for emotional distress from multiple families. They didn't apologize. Wealthy people rarely did, but their attorney sent a terse letter stating they were withdrawing their complaint in the interest of allowing all parties to move forward. Legal speak for we got caught and were cutting our losses. I signed the settlement papers feeling oddly hollow, like I'd won something important but lost something too, though I couldn't quite identify what. Zoe went back to school 3 weeks after the incident. I drove her that first day, walking her all the way to her classroom even though she was old enough to walk herself. Mrs. Alvarez, her teacher, pulled me aside and apologized with tears in her eyes. She said she'd tried to address the Marcus situation, but had been told by administration to handle it quietly, that she'd felt powerless and had failed both Lily and Zoe by not pushing harder. I told her I understood, that individual teachers were victims of the same system that had failed everyone, but that things were changing now. Mrs. Alvarez said she'd been documenting everything going forward, that she had files on every classroom incident with timestamps and witness statements, that she wasn't going to be complicit in covering up problems anymore. Other teachers were doing the same, she said, creating their own unofficial accountability system since they didn't trust administration to follow through even with new policies. Lily's family ended up moving to a different neighborhood with a better school district, which felt like both victory and defeat. Mrs. Chen called to say goodbye, to thank us again, to promise they'd stay in touch. Lily gave Zoe a handmade card with an elaborate drawing of 2 girls holding hands with best friends forever, written in careful English. They exchanged phone numbers and promised to video chat, though I knew with the certainty of adult experience that they'd probably drift apart, that childhood friendships rarely survive geographical separation. But maybe I was wrong. Maybe some bonds forged in crisis lasted longer than comfort friendships. I hoped so. Zoe cried when Lily left. Real heartbroken tears that made me want to fix things I couldn't fix, protect her from losses I couldn't prevent. I held her and told her that sometimes doing the right thing costs something, that standing up for people means watching them move on afterward, that heroism isn't always rewarded with fairy tale endings. The local news did a follow-up story 6 weeks later. District implements new anti-bullying measures following student intervention controversy. The reporter interviewed Fletcher, who emphasized the district's commitment to student safety and transparent reporting. They interviewed several parents, including me, though they edited my comments down to generic statements about hoping this led to lasting change. They didn't interview the Thornhills, who'd apparently moved to a suburb 30 miles away where private schools were, apparently less selective about behavioral history if the tuition checks cleared. I wondered sometimes what would happen to Marcus, whether he'd ever face real consequences or just continue hurting people until he was too big for lunch trays to stop him. But he wasn't my problem anymore, wasn't my daughter's problem anymore, and I had to let that be enough. Zoe changed after that day, not dramatically. She was still quiet, still brought home injured birds and cried during sad commercials. But there was a steel underneath now, a certainty that hadn't been there before. She'd learned that adults failed children regularly, that institutional protection was often illusion, that sometimes you had to fight for people yourself even when everyone told you violence wasn't the answer. I worried that lesson would make her cynical or hard, but mostly it seemed to make her more aware, more vigilant about protecting vulnerable people. She joined the school's peer mediation program, helped translate for new students who didn't speak English fluently, reported every incident of bullying she witnessed with meticulous documentation. Other kids started coming to her when they had problems, treating her like someone who'd actually do something instead of just offering empty sympathy. The scholarship fund grew beyond the settlement amount. Other families who'd been helped by the policy changes donated, local businesses contributed, teachers added money from their own pockets. By the time Zoe graduated elementary school, it had grown to $50,000. Enough to cover a significant portion of a state university education. The fund was named the Zoe Defenders Scholarship and would be available to any student in the district who demonstrated courage in protecting others from harm. Ortega helped set it up as a nonprofit with proper oversight, ensuring it would continue beyond our family's involvement. At the dedication ceremony, Fletcher gave a speech about how one child's choice to intervene had changed an entire district's approach to student safety, how sometimes the smallest people made the biggest impact, how courage looked like a 9-year-old girl with a lunch tray deciding enough was enough. I still think about that day sometimes, about the phone call that interrupted my lunch break, about walking into that office and seeing my daughter covered in another kid's blood. I think about how close I came to believing the official narrative, to accepting that Zoe had done something wrong that required punishment. If I hadn't asked for her side of the story, if I hadn't recorded that meeting, if I hadn't been willing to fight back against people with more money and power, the outcome would have been very different. Zoe would have been expelled or suspended. Marcus would still be hurting kids. The systemic failures would have continued unchecked. Sometimes I wake up at night thinking about all the children in situations where parents can't fight back, where families don't have access to pro bono attorneys or paralegal friends or knowledge of how to work the system. How many kids are punished for defending themselves or others because they don't have advocates willing to challenge authority? But mostly I think about that moment in Fletcher's office when she told me the Thornhills couldn't find a school willing to take Marcus, when all their money and influence couldn't protect them from the consequences of their son's documented violence. That's when I started laughing, inappropriate laughter that I couldn't quite control, because after weeks of stress and fear and uncertainty, there was finally something resembling justice. Not perfect justice, there's no such thing. Not complete justice. Lily's family still had to move, Davison's career was still destroyed, the systemic failures took years to fully address. But some justice. The kind where bullies faced consequences, where protecting the vulnerable mattered more than protecting institutional reputation, where a 9-year-old girl's courage exposed corruption that adults had been complicit in for years. I had to take my daughter to the hospital that day. Well, not literally. The blood was Marcus's and Zoe's bruised elbow didn't require medical attention. But metaphorically, I had to carry her through a system designed to protect the wrong people, through an ordeal where doing the right thing looked like violence and standing up for others meant facing adult consequences. And I couldn't stop laughing, because the absurdity of it all, The fact that it took a lunch tray and a brave child to fix what countless parent complaints and administrative reviews had failed to address was either hilarious or devastating, and I'd been devastated enough. So I laughed, and then I fought, and somehow, impossibly, we won. Thanks for watching till the end. Make sure to subscribe and like to not miss the next story.